Hi everyone, it's Mike G here today with a review of a pretty recent and pretty generally praised literary fiction novel, The Dutch House by Anne Patchett. This novel was published in 2019 and was a 2020 finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. Anne Patchett is a prominent writer and novelist who's published, it seems now, 8 novels and a variety of other nonfiction works. Since her very first novel, The Patron Saint of Liars, was published in 1992, a lot of these works, such as Bel Canto and State of Wonder, have received a lot of attention, but perhaps none so much as her latest novel, The Dutch House. I don't really know how the attention compares, but The Dutch House received quite a bit of attention. I haven't read much of Patchett's work myself. The only other book by her that I read prior to this one was her second most recent novel, I think, from 2016, Commonwealth, which I believe was also pretty well received and which I thought was alright, but it didn't really speak to me that much, and ultimately I found it pretty forgettable, even if well written. Still, since she's such a beloved author, and I'm still seeing The Dutch House really often in my recommendations and everything like that, I decided to give Anne Patchett another shot. I listened to the audiobook version of this book, which normally isn't worth talking about too much, but in this case it's narrated by the one and only Tom Hanks, and he does an excellent job conveying the main character Danny in a way that really makes this novel a joy to read. And The Dutch House turned out to be one of my favorite reads of the year thus far, which is all the more impressive given that nothing happens in it. Nothing much. Okay, that's not really true, but it's just hard to articulate what it's really about. Much like real life, it feels not so much like there is an inherent plot or story to it all, but merely a semi-coherent meta-narrative that is formed from this experience by the characters themselves, and subsequently by the readers. The Dutch House follows one family, but really specifically one brother and sister, the narrator Danny and his sister Maeve, from their early childhood living in the Dutch house across a time period of about 5 decades. And throughout this entire time, the characters still retain a certain emotional attachment, or in some cases, even an obsession with their childhood home. So I liked The Dutch House much better than Commonwealth, which I listened to several years ago, and maybe just wasn't the right time for me then, but I think the fact that Commonwealth focused on a whole family of children, and really not even just one family, because it was kind of 2 families united by marriage or an affair, or I forget exactly what, I think that made it a little harder for me to really discover the characters in the same way that I discovered Maeve and especially Danny in The Dutch House. The Dutch House is also going to be more memorable for me because it has at least one unifying motif throughout the novel, which is the Dutch House. And it's referred to as just that. They call it the Dutch House. I thought to myself as I progressed through this novel that the Dutch House is almost an inanimate character in itself, which sounds kind of goofy, but then I was amused to find in listening to the other YouTube reviews on it that some other reviewers thought pretty much the exact same thing. And as an aside, I listened to a lot of YouTube reviews on this book, and I encourage you to do so as well because there's really a lot of good material already out there on this one, including some extended discussions. So the Dutch House is a mood, a symbol, a setting, and later a meeting point in this novel. It becomes an arguably unhealthy obsession of Maeve and maybe somewhat of the narrator too, as it constantly reminds them of how it took their mother away from them. You see, when they were young, Danny and Maeve's father purchased this opulent house after finding success in real estate investing, a sort of rags to riches story, and he intended it as a surprise for his wife, or Danny and Maeve's mother, but to her it was the exact opposite. As a devout Catholic attached to her ideas of caring for the poor and needy, she absolutely hated the wealth and excess that it represented, or at least she hated how this contradiction made her feel. Thus, it's implied, at least from the children's point of view, that this was the act that ultimately started tearing their mother and father apart, leading up to the point where their mother eventually just left them one day, never to return. That's all revealed to us in the first few chapters, by the way, but I'm going to just give you all a warning now that from here on, this entire review may contain spoilers. And by that I mean anything that wouldn't be evident from reading the jacket description or the first few chapters. I will warn you later, though, before I start talking about some of the more late-breaking spoilers that are going to be important to discuss to really dig deeper into the themes of the book, but even from here, I'm going to go into a few mild spoilers. If I had to take a stab at why this book was so well received despite being the kind of book that is inherently fairly challenging due to the lack of a driving plot, it's because the characterization, particularly of the main character, is stellar. These don't feel like characters who are there to teach you a moral or to be a stand-in for some general greater idea. Any lessons we learn from them feel more incidental than highly intentional. The characters in themselves are interesting really first and foremost in their believability. There's nothing too flashy or exciting about these characters. They really could all just be people I know. But they're also interesting in the ways they relate to one another and how that changes throughout the characters' lives. And what got really interesting to me was thinking about how these interactions later influenced those characters' personalities, and comparing or contrasting how different characters reacted to often similar external forces. Despite observing a ton about these characters and how they respond to various life situations, I still felt by the end of the novel like I didn't really quite know them. But this isn't in a sense where I didn't know this character because he or she wasn't well developed in the book. It's more in the same way that for people in my own life who I'm casually acquainted with, or even those that I'm really close with, there's plenty about them and the decisions that they've made and just everything going on inside their minds that I just can't quite fully understand or I don't quite know. And that's how it feels in this novel. The exception is the narrator, Danny, who we get to know quite a bit by hearing his internal account. Although Danny's personality complicates things a bit too because he's not very emotionally intelligent, let's say. And this applies not only to understanding others' emotions, but also his own emotions. As a result, his style of storytelling is not particularly aware of how he and others feel. We only see his emotions through the way he interacts with other people or when he notices something without really understanding, with a sort of, I don't know why, but this really annoyed me kind of comment. But in this novel, we learn about the characters not just through their interactions with one another, but also through their interactions with the Dutch house, their attitudes towards it, and how they think about it. Danny's father and mother both had a very specific relationship with the house, his father seeing it kind of as a fulfillment of his labors, the fruit of his life's work, a sort of proving himself to the world, while his mother, on the other hand, absolutely despised the opulence that it symbolized to her, and ultimately it led her to just simply get up and leave. And then Danny and Maeve and their stepmother Andrea, and even the housekeepers Sandy and Fluffy and Jocelyn, all have more complicated but similarly revealing relationships with the house. Maeve is obsessed with the house in a way that is really bizarre but strangely still kind of believable, and she takes her brother Danny whenever they get the chance to basically just camp out in front of the house and reminisce. For Maeve, it's a symbol of the past. Maybe you could say the symbol of everything that went wrong in her life, especially her mother's leaving. Past events that Maeve simply can't let go of. And her mother leaving was really a devastating experience for Maeve, more so than anyone else. And as for our narrator, Danny, well, he seems to enjoy these stakeouts, but mostly just because they're a chance to be with his sister, who's almost a mother figure to him in many ways, and who is always kind of holding the strings and directing his life in ways that he appreciates only partially. So it makes sense that he seems to be there reminiscing at the Dutch house only because Maeve has said that's what's going to happen. I think all of these dynamics between the characters in the house were really well executed by Ann Patchett and a clever device, because although how characters feel about a house is an imperfect way of getting to know them and only reveals so much, they're also far less guarded or strategic about the ways they interact with or talk about a house than with other humans around them. Let's get into some characters now, just a bit more though. To do that, I'm going to have to gradually start getting into some deeper spoilers, I guess, so even though this isn't a super spoilable book, consider yourself warned. So Maeve and Danny, as I mentioned, are the two characters who the novel revolves around. Maeve really feels in some ways like the main character throughout this book, despite Danny being the one telling the events to us, because although Danny doesn't necessarily quite grasp the extent of it or the unusualness of it, Maeve basically outlines Danny's entire life's trajectory for him with varying amounts of success at different times, but to an extent that his eventual wife Celeste finds unhealthy, and I'd really have to agree with her on that. Never mind, of course, that Maeve is in kind of the reason why Danny and Celeste got together in the first place, since he was basically just ignoring her when he met her. Now, several times during the book, Danny expresses horror at the thought that Maeve might die before him. She's also, this is a bit of a spoiler here because it's not very clear until late in the book, we learn that she's the one who is in the portrait on the cover of the book. And the book pretty much ends when Maeve meets her end. Despite all this, she never was quite as full to us as Danny. We never get to know her quite as well as we might have liked, or really understand what drove her. Maybe it's that she was too complicated, or maybe the blame falls on Danny for not explaining her to us well enough. Or maybe I'm just not observant or aware enough to have decrypted her. I don't think it's that, though. I think for the most part, it's a combination of Danny's not being that sensitive and Maeve's not being that expressive. For example, did Maeve ever have a romantic relationship with anyone in her life? We might take her word at face value that she never did, or we might speculate, as some did, that she had something more than friendship with Mr. Otterson, I think was his name, the guy who she worked for. I even wondered at one point whether she might be gay, which would have likely been a big thing for her to reckon with if she was really devoted to her Catholic faith, as She might have been, although even there, her level of devotion is kind of a mystery. Maeve's inner personality, what makes her tick, really feels like a don't ask, don't tell kind of thing in this book, because Dany is never quite curious enough to press her, which means we learn about her mostly only through the things that she herself chooses to reveal to us. Maeve is also the only character that we really see Dany bond with. Dany is a difficult character in that he doesn't really seem to have much empathy for anyone else in the novel. Well, either that, or you could argue that he does have empathy, but that he just doesn't know how to articulate it. But his actions suggest to me that that's not really the case. You see, I'd be hard-pressed to find occasions in the book where Dany tries to actually envision what the other characters are feeling, even sometimes when it would be to his own advantage. This is especially evident in his relationship with his wife Celeste, who always seems like she's kept around as a matter of convenience and without much thought for her as an actual person. His decision to marry her is entirely a matter of strategy, and he describes it to us as such. The path of least resistance for him, not one of love or commitment. Of course, that's not to say that he's actively malicious or manipulative of his wife or the others around him. He just doesn't think twice about their feelings. He usually only really thinks about people as they relate to his own life story. We see something similar when he has kids whom he doesn't really get to know at all, which is especially evident from the way they only rarely show up in the narrative at all, not nearly as often as Maeve, and even then generally not as proper characters with human feelings. They mostly only appear when they're vaguely relevant to the scene. It's like Dany has become the father that his father was to him. A thought that I want to hold on to and come back to a bit later, because I think that's a big theme in this book. And even in his relationship with his sister Maeve, you could wonder to what extent he feels affection for her as a person. Like, he never quite describes her to us on the level of an actual person with feelings, although I got the impression that in her case, there may have actually been some real empathy that he simply didn't know how to express well to us readers. Still, by and large, he hardly has many moments that are particularly admirable in the way that he interacts with and how he even thinks of other characters, which is a quality that Hanks portrays really well in the audiobook narration. And despite all this, or really because all of this, Dany for me was such an effective character. Like, I'm here telling you that Dany is frustrating and has little regard for the feelings of others, and yet I find it really hard to judge him too harshly. I found it really fun reading and listening to reviews on this book because there's a genuinely wide range of reactions to this guy as a character. There are people who pretty much described him as trash, but others who really loved him in a way, and maybe I didn't hear anyone say that they truly admired him, but I saw a lot of empathy for him, a lot of people who felt bad for him as they saw how the pieces of his life fit together to ultimately make him who he became. And of course, what I find awesome about this is that I don't just think, well, some people weren't reading the book closely enough and they're wrong. I can see both of these versions of Dany in the narrative, and I think he appeared in both of these ways to people in his life. Really, they're just different ways of viewing the same guy that is Dany. And that, for me, is the sign of a good character. I think a lot could be said as well about Dany's father, his stepmom Andrea, Sandy, Jocelyn, and Fluffy, the employees at the Dutch house, even some of the other characters that make an appearance. But since I don't want this review to just go on forever, I'm going to mention just one other character, Dany's mom, Elna, because I found her a really interesting character, with one exception that I'll get to in a minute. We learned that Elna felt deeply about her religious convictions and considered joining a convent on more than one occasion, and that ultimately she ran off to India out of a sense of duty to serve the poor. And yet later on we hear that she didn't stay in India for all that long, that she returned to somewhere in the States, to a place where, I think in her own words, they actually needed her, or something like that. The irony, of course, is that although Elna was perhaps right in her assessment that she could do more good for people in her own community, one that she deeply knew and understood, than by rushing off to India to do who knows what possibly ill-conceived project. But this all feels besides the point for someone who abandoned her own children to go perform this service. Now, I don't want to sound too definitive in my judgment of this character because I think readers might have a lot of different feelings about the meaning or the morality of Elna's decisions, just as some in the novel call her a saint, which leads others to wonder if saints were actually liked by the people they knew. The end of the arc for Elna, though, is that in part 3 of the book, she does eventually find her family and come back and regret leaving them, which is really nice and really tidy, and it's the part that I didn't like about how she was written. Though it was nice to see Elna return to her family, it felt to me too tidy and too convenient. Instead of letting readers ponder the question of, well, should she have left her family? I mean, maybe she really was doing valuable work for the poor. Maybe those are the people that really needed her. Instead of that, though, we get an answer from the character herself. Nope, it was wrong, but I'm back now. and then all the characters hop into a car and head off to the Dutch house, where Elna will repent of her sins by caring for the evil stepmother, Andrea, for the rest of her days. Yeah, that sounds a little ridiculous when I say it like that, but that is how it all ends, which is kind of ridiculous to me, which is why I think part 3 of this book was by no means bad, but it was by far the weakest part of the novel, which is 3 parts. I think, in fact, it might have been stronger for me if the novel had ended earlier. That's just me, though. Some people like the ending. I don't know. What do you think? There are likewise a ton of interesting themes touched on in this book, all the more so because many of them are sort of minor themes, not exactly driving the entire narrative of the book, but popping up from time to time in a way that does make you think, and might even make you think more upon a second read. I couldn't even begin to touch on all of them, but I would like to mention a few. For one thing, we get a pretty nice discussion of religion, not about the essence of religion itself, but about the values and social norms that religious affiliation brings with it, and the role it plays, whether deep or superficial, in the characters' lives. All the characters in the family are Catholic, and I'm pretty sure they remain so throughout the book, but this means different things for different characters. For Danny and Maeve's mother, it's central to her identity and conveys this almost overwhelming sense of duty to serve others, and I've already discussed the irony of where that ultimately leads her. For their father, it's a rigid rule for him to follow. We always go to Mass on Sunday, he says, whether out of duty to his wife, his social community, or some other sense of commitment that he feels. And it probably has subtly affected his life and values, but we don't see it too much. And it does seem as if some of his actions speak otherwise. We learn more about Maeve's and Danny's relationship to their faith later in the book, although for them, or at least for Maeve, the exact nature of their religiosity remains open to interpretation. For Danny, I guess you could say he doesn't disavow it, but it doesn't play any significant role in his life. And this was all super interesting because Anne Patchett comes from a Catholic family. I also come from a Catholic family. And while as a child it might have just seemed like the way we did things was just how all Catholics did things, as you grow you realize that for other Catholics in the local community, around the country, and even around the world, being a self-identified Catholic can mean a lot of different things and can penetrate one's life and identity at various levels of depth. There are discussions of class in this novel too. Some readers might even find this book as a whole rather boring or off-putting in that it focuses mostly on characters of an upper middle class background, living life pretty comfortably, still facing many of the universal interpersonal challenges, but fairly unaware of how their well-off background places them within the broader societal framework and how the rest of society views them, which we see in Danny's interactions as a boy with the housekeepers at his house. He doesn't even realize that 2 of them are sisters until they've been working there for a very long time. Of course, it's a little more complicated than that, as we learn that Danny's father was a sort of rags to riches story, and Danny sort of views himself as the same since their stepmother Andrea essentially claimed most of their inheritance in the Dutch house itself, forcing Danny to start over again. But here, Anne Patchett kind of exposes this contrast between a literal rags to riches story and people who maybe think of themselves a little bit as rags to riches, but really started off from a place quite above the level of rags. Danny may not have assets, and that poses a bit of a challenge to him in getting started in the real estate investment business. Still, he's hardly a nobody in his upper middle class world. He's attended medical school at Columbia, for goodness sake, and it's from this very experience that he casually learns that a certain set of parking lots near the university might become quite valuable quite soon, as some new medical school buildings are going to have to go up somewhere around that very spot. So Danny's story, like his father's, which we learn about later, was hardly a case of someone with almost nothing to begin with, risking everything on a mere whim, even if that's the way that it may have played out in his own mind. And one other theme that we see a lot is this idea of changing into a different person as we grow up, one who looks strangely like our own parents, even in ways we don't admire. We're first exposed to the idea early in the novel when young Danny realizes with shock that the strangely attractive young girl in the painting at the Dutch house is one and the same as the elderly Mrs. Van Hoobeck that he's seen in another painting. He knows they must be one and the same, but he just can't fathom how these 2 are the same person. In fact, he's still not really sure that they are. Like, what is it that really connects the 2 of them? This thought of changing into a different person as we grow older and become detached from our earlier experiences is kind of tabled for a little while, but eventually it becomes hard for us to overlook the ways in which Danny resembles his own father, not only in his successes, in which he kind of chooses to emulate his father, like in his real estate business, but also in his failures, like being a lousy husband and probably even a lousier father. I do have to say that at least on one occasion, this became just a bit too in your face for me. When we learned that Celeste and Danny divorced shortly after Danny bought a nice new home to impress his wife, At that point, I was like, give me a break. You're clueless, but you're not that clueless. Like you've spent the whole book telling us how big of a mistake it was that your father did this. Still, for the most part, I thought this theme was done pretty well and left a lot open for interpretation. In fact, Maeve seems even a more interesting case of this because I saw not only elements of her biological mother in her, but also of her despised stepmother, Andrea. For example, for all she complained about how Andrea was a heartless, spiteful woman out to ruin their lives, a characterization with some amount of truth, but probably not as much as she'd like us to believe, in the end, we see Maeve strong-arm Danny into getting the most expensive education he possibly can, simply to deplete the family's college trust so that there's none left for her younger stepsisters Norma and Bright. An act that feels especially cruel towards the end of the book when we learn that these girls were really nothing like their mother Andrea, which was pretty evident to us readers from the start, and from what we know, they were arguably more wholesome characters than Danny and Maeve themselves. For all of you watching this review, though, I'm curious what other themes you noticed that I didn't mention, and maybe I didn't even notice at all myself. Let me know if you saw any big ones, or even small ones, that I missed. There's so much good stuff for discussion in this book, but I'm going to wrap this up now because this is already going to be one of my longer reviews. This is certainly literary fiction, and I really appreciate what Ann Patchett is doing with this and her other novels. But unlike Commonwealth, which wasn't exactly bad but just kind of fell flat for me, at least at the time I read it, this was one I found really captivating. Sure, there's still that part of me that keeps asking, but what was the point? Who cares about this big Dutch house at the end of the day? Aren't there a million stories out there like this? Is this even a story, or is it just the recounting of a pretty ordinary person's life? And to that, I guess I just have to say, maybe that's much of the value of writing like Ann Patchett's, and that she's taking the events of ordinary life and presenting them in a way that feels immersive, captivating, and makes me think and form my own story out of it. Like, if there was an obvious point to this novel, then would I even like it as much? Would it be as effective? I guess this is all just showing me that I could enjoy reading more literary fiction type novels. So let me know if you've read any of Ann Patchett's other stuff that you think I or others watching this video might like. Given the success of The Dutch House, I probably will check out something else by her eventually, even if not immediately. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you made it this far and want to keep hearing more dedicated reviews on a whole variety of different books. Until next time, bye and happy reading.